Hello, as I said in the first part of this series, there are a million abandoned houses in Britain, and there is a reason for it. And I put it down to the fact that in capitalism we have an unattainable surplus. That is, a surplus is created, but that people don't have the means to attain that surplus. So that surplus gets wasted. It becomes abandoned and derelict homes which no one can have, and so they get forcibly taken off of the owners by the government. Okay, which then sell them to other people. So perhaps they don't get abandoned forever, but for a long part of the time they are becoming derelict. That might be up to 15 years. So there are massive mansions in Mayfair which are completely empty of people, whilst other people are crammed into tiny little slum flats, either run by private owners or council owners, which have no good furniture. I used to do deliveries to when I just left school to council houses and flats, and particularly council flats look like prisons. Worse than prisons. There's no paint on the walls. It's horrible. The people who live there don't want to live there. There's damp. There's other problems. Crime, antisocial behaviour. So, as I said in the first part, what the solution to this is to decouple the link between being rich and having tremendous amounts of property. So the solution being, i.e. that you create a system where the rich can live in large scale apartment buildings with massive apartments, for instance, because they won't accept not owning property without the perks of having a luxurious lifestyle. So if you look back at sort of like the film noir or films about like the 80s, the stockbroker films like Wall Street, for instance, where the guys are living in a penthouse, those kind of buildings. But of course, they would all be in occupancy, because the owner of the building has an interest in making sure that those apartments are always kept up in occupancy, full occupancy, of course. And also, if those places were partly privately and publicly owned, okay, so you would always have an income, and a large income, because obviously rich people's proportion that they spend on their housing and their food bills and all the rest of it is far smaller than the proportion that people are in poverty have to spend. And of course, if someone's homeless, then they are spending probably most of their income, if that they get from whatever job, from whatever black market job they're doing, or from begging or whatever, on just simply getting food. Now, as I said, if we create a system where there was social services for the rich, there would be a surplus of those, and then everybody would get enough in terms of social service, and the rich would make sure that those social services were of good quality, because they have the means to sue people, which the poor do not. Okay, the poor are less likely to sue somebody if they get trod on. Unfortunately, it should be the other way around. Right, now, to give an example of what's wrong with the system that is creating gated communities and massive mansions which are abandoned and slums, you only need to look at, say, the areas of and also influx of immigrants who are being mixed with people who are being forced down into the underclass, okay, for cheap labour. You only have to look at areas like Brixton, Bermondsey, Peckham, Streatham, Lewisham. Those areas were once suburbs, and now they're considered very urban areas. Yeah. Now, my family came from those areas, and whilst not everybody owned their house, the vast majority of people who lived there, although they may have worked on the docks or my great uncle, for instance, had a similar experience as Dockers, because he was a medical student and they used to make the medical students fight just like the Dockers. Now that's unheard of because today, because you go to university to get your start in becoming a medical student, but that's how great the competition was for jobs back in that time. Okay, I'm talking like 19th century. Okay, late 19th century, early 20th century. Now, sort of First World War era. Now, if you look around the areas around like certain famous football clubs around London, right? I'm not going to let you know which football club I support, right? But there are large suburban houses there, okay, which are of course occupied now. But during that period of the 1930s to 1970s, and then especially during the 80s, when you started to get like feudalistic property magnates who were just seizing up properties all over the place, because the Thatcherite government put us into three recessions, which then you got distressed housing or repossessions, which came in, and then people, rich people, basically snapped up those houses and chopped them up into as many small flats as you can get. And some of the states and the quality of the building were, of course, plasterboards instead of structural walls, which should have been there. Places that were built in the Victorian times, which are still standing, compared to some of the places, some of the things that were built in the 80s and 60s, which are falling into disrepair because of just poor quality materials. Now, the 60s, you might say, it could be forgiven slightly because we're still in deep debt from the Second World War, and masses of parts of London were still derelict from the Second World War. But in the 80s, 80s and 90s, we were almost paid off our debt to the Second World War. So that was just greed, okay. Now, as I said before, to fix this problem, to make sure that people don't become homeless, you need a link between student fees and mortgages and the work that people do. Now, you could have housing cooperatives, right, where everybody is a shareholder in the business of building houses, and then those people are investing that thing, or they're given shares by the government. They then live in those houses, and then it spreads out and out and out, further and further as the business becomes more successful. And certain supermarkets in this country, and of course the cooperative bank, are cooperatives themselves, so that business model does work. Now, the other thing is to link mortgages with student loans, so people can get an instant student loan from their university and get a house straight away. So young couples with their first child or children on the way can immediately have a house, instead of people who have left the university and left the army. In some cases, in many cases it is the army, whose families are living in absolute squalor, whose flats that they've been put in are leaking, all right, when they've got children in the house, okay, who are just newborns, all right. The state of army family housing is absolutely terrible in this country, okay. And instead of giving trillions of dollars to banks who are owned by gangsters, perhaps we should be giving more to families who have just left, families who are starting out in university, or who have just left the army, especially those ones who have just been out fighting the Bin Ladens and the private armies of the Bin Ladens in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay. Please check out the rest of my vids and join the movement to support Boer independence, okay, in South Africa, and stop the genocide of the ANC. Thank you, peace, and see you later.